from Sharm el-Sheikh here in Egypt. Now, as we mentioned before, every day we have a theme, and today we're still having these discussions around the Finance Day. But the conversation now that we are about to have, it's around the food security and climate change in agricultural finance. Around 80% of people most at the risk from crop failures and hunger driven by climate change globally are small-scale farmers, family living in global south countries. This number is quite scary, and to gain more insight into this phenomenon, I'm glad to welcome Mr. Alvaro Lario, the President of International Fund for Agricultural Development. Welcome to COP27 TV.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you today and to have the conversation about what's very dear to us: small-scale farming, food systems, climate adaptation.
Exactly. Let me start by asking you why it's so important to help small-scale farmers to adapt in the changes in the climate.
So actually, small-scale farmers are the ones who are producing the food, who are part of the entire value chain. And in reality, we could say that they are at the core of food systems, and food systems we're seeing are at the core of global stability. When small-scale farmers cannot produce, when small-scale farmers cannot really even feed themselves, what we are seeing is forced migration, and we are seeing them actually that has a big impact on the community and on their livelihood. So we have to make sure that we create the opportunities for them to be able to be self-reliant, to focus on national and local production, and to connect them to the markets so that the share they get from the value chain is a fair share that provides them with a decent living wage.
So could you share with us some concrete examples of actions that farmers can take to adapt to climate change? And also, I would like to know what are the potential consequences in case these small-scale farmers don't receive enough support?
So let me start with the consequences, because they are quite dramatic. We are seeing it. There's conflict increasing because of the scarce natural resources. We are seeing them having to migrate. We are seeing that they have had to sell their assets. They have had to sell their inputs, their food, in order to feed themselves in many cases. So that has a massive impact, both globally as well as in neighboring countries. In terms of, and that's a very good question, in terms of what it means, climate adaptation, we all talk about climate adaptation,
exactly.
Agriculture, how is it tangible? Well, in our case, we implement on the ground with the government. That means early warning systems, it means drought-resilient seeds, drought-resilient crops, small-scale irrigations, precision irrigation, water management, soil management. So you can see climate-proof infrastructure, so that means when there's floodings, the road actually do not just fall under. So it's very concrete ways to make their living and creating those opportunities that help them stay where they are and have a job.
So small-scale farmers are essential to global food security, as you just mentioned. But again, they only receive 1.7% of climate finance. So what the consequences that you just mentioned is really, really big, and it's dangerous also for everyone, not just like for these countries. But what about the finance? Why they don't receive the finance that they need to basically to do this adaptation and to just, you know, in order not to arrive to those consequences?
Well, I would say, unfortunately, at IFAD we have been talking about resilience, about climate adaptation, about small-scale farmers for more than 4 decades. The unfair and unjust war in Ukraine has made that we have paid much more attention to food security. Some of the spillovers of the war have been affecting globally. But I would say that generally they have not received enough attention. What we are seeing now from the global leaders is that food security is becoming national security. So it's becoming also a priority for many of them, and especially in the rural areas, to see how they can really make sure that their marginalized and vulnerable populations receive the fair share of the climate finance. That will translate in having the job opportunities, as I said. Adaptation is actually about investment. It's a driver of growth. it's a driver of job opportunities, it's not only a cost. And it's very important that they receive this financing to make sure that they can have a decent living.
Well, speaking about investment, it's interesting to know how we could bring the private sector to the table, because we always see governments, monetary fund, the World Bank, and the big institutions, the big, finance institutions. I think that private sector has a role to play, and they can be very effective in the rural areas, as you mentioned. How to bring them to the table, how to engage the private sector more in for the upcoming maybe 5 years, 10 years terms?
So I think when we talk about the private sector, we all call for them for action, to do something. It's not always clear what we are asking them for. I think first of all, we need an enabling environment to make sure that in the value chain, we bring them at the risk and return that they can actually take, that we can de-risk and we can mobilize the financing. So let me give you some examples. In our case, what we try is to not only talk about subsistence farming, but that farming as a business, as a job creator, as a way for small-scale producers to actually be able to create jobs and to have opportunities. Let me put you an example. I was in the north of Côte d'Ivoire, and actually there you had more than 1,000 women working in a cooperative. Before they had rotten mangoes. Now what they did is actually they used dried mangoes. They started to package them to be able to market them, and they were exporting them to Switzerland. That's an example of how a lot of different small plots of land came together in a cooperative. We can do many more of those. There are special agri-zone projects that we have been working with the African Development Bank and other partners in Nigeria, how to connect the small-scale producers to markets. I think that's an important component. When we talk about the big private businesses, when we talk about asset management, the billions to trillions, that's a very different story. There, I think the structuring of the platforms, the financing, is very important that we make it in a way that is appealing to them. We're currently working on exploring how we can attract, for example, 1 billion of a pension fund and what that would translate on the ground on specific investment projects for 10, 15 years that could be commercially viable for them. So there's a lot of parts on the private sector. From our side at IFAD, we were the first UN fund who got a credit rating. So with that, we have been able to attract impact investors' money and pension funds to actually lend to IFAD at very interesting rates.
So what does it mean to you to have the COP27 here hosted by an African country? Because like we were speaking about examples from Africa, and basically also like the highlight related to finance, it's like Africa. And what agriculture experience could Africa share from this platform? So for sure, when it comes to agriculture, Africa has like certain experience regard that. So what do also Africa could give to the world in this regard?
So I would say that the government of Egypt has put a very, very important project together, a flagship program of more than 14 billion Newafi, which brings together water, energy, and food. IFAD is leading on the food track. We have mobilized more than 2 billion with other partners. We are aspiring to 3.3 billion. I think this relates to food systems, food insecurity, not being only about agriculture, it's about energy, it's about infrastructure, it's about, I would say, even education. When we see in our projects that women have access to land, when women have access to the assets, that has also an impact on the family, that has an impact on the children, on the diets that they consume, and also on the ability of the mothers to send their children to school. So it's an ecosystem that we have to nurture.
So if we want to estimate, I mean, I'm not asking for a fixed number, but in case we need to estimate, how much would be the budget for the world urgently to solve the food crisis?
So in terms perhaps, the food crisis has many components. So let me perhaps talk about climate adaptation and what we need on the developing countries. So there was a very recent report by a UN agency, by UNEP, and they were estimating between 160 billion to 340 billion per year up to 2030. So those are massive figures that will translate even more than 500 billion by 2050. So it's not enough with official development assistance, government support, private sector. It's very clear that unless the entire planet rallies behind this, we will not be able to really make the difference.
Great. My last question to you. what you are expecting at the end of COP27 and what it can be a good handover to COP28 coming next year in Dubai for this subject of adaptation and food security.
So to me, COP27 is COP of adaptation, but it's COP of implementation. So it's very clear we are showing, and I try to get to all of the events I'm participating, the signatures, memorandums of understanding that translate into a pipeline, that actually there's something happening on the ground and that we are able to make a difference in implementing. When I talk about some of the projects we're doing in the Sahel, the Wi-Fi announcement, all of that is going to translate into specific projects that will be implemented, that are being already implemented on the ground, that change the lives of people. That's the important part.
Mr. Alvaro Lario, thank you very much for your insight and thanks for being with us at COP27
Thank you
TV.
very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.